On March 30th, 1853, in the quiet Dutch village of Groot-Zundert, Anna Carbentus van Gogh gave birth to a son. She named him Vincent Willem van Gogh, after his father, the local Protestant pastor. But there was something deeply unsettling about this birth that would cast a shadow over the boy's entire existence. Exactly 1 year before, to the very day, Anna had given birth to another son. At first, Vincent Willem van Gogh had lived for only 6 weeks before dying in his mother's arms. The grief had been overwhelming. Anna had fallen into a deep depression that lasted months. Pastor Theodorus van Gogh had buried his firstborn son in the small cemetery next to their church, marking the grave with a simple stone that read Vincent van Gogh, 1852 to 1852. Now 12 months later, Anna held another baby with the exact same name. The decision to reuse the name wasn't unusual for the time, but the psychological impact on the surviving child would prove devastating. Every March 30th, when Vincent should have been celebrating his birthday, the family instead marked it as a day of remembrance for the dead brother he had replaced. Growing up, Vincent would walk past that gravestone almost daily on his way to and from the village. There, carved in stone, was his own name, his own birth year, but with a death date that preceded his own birth. Imagine being a young child and seeing your own name on a tombstone, knowing that you existed only because another version of yourself had failed to survive. The Van Gogh household was one of quiet respectability, but little warmth. Pastor Theodorus was a stern, dutiful man who served his small congregation with dedication, but struggled to connect with his children on an emotional level. He was the kind of father who believed that children should be seen and not heard, that discipline and proper behaviour were more important than affection or understanding. Anna never fully recovered from the loss of her first Vincent. She became a woman who held her surviving children at arm's length, as if loving them too deeply might invite another tragedy. Vincent in particular seemed to remind her of her loss. He had the same intense eyes, the same restless energy that she remembered from those 6 weeks with her first son. As a result, Vincent grew up feeling like a ghost in his own family. He was the replacement child who could never quite fill the void left by the brother he had never known. This sense of being fundamentally unwanted, of being a poor substitute for someone better, would follow him throughout his life and influence every relationship he ever attempted. Vincent was not an easy child. While his younger siblings, Anna, Theo, Elizabeth, Wilhelmina and Cornelis, seemed to adapt well to the family's reserved atmosphere, Vincent was different. He was moody, intense, and prone to violent outbursts when frustrated. Where other children might have tantrums that lasted minutes, Vincent's emotional storms could go on for hours. His behaviour baffled his parents. Pastor Van Gogh had dealt with difficult parishioners, but he had no framework for understanding his eldest son's emotional volatility. Anna found Vincent's intensity exhausting and often left his care to the family's domestic help. The message was clear to young Vincent. He was too much, too difficult, too different. The one bright spot in Vincent's childhood was his relationship with his younger brother Theo, who was born in 1857 when Vincent was 4 years old. From the moment Theo could walk, Vincent appointed himself as the boy's protector and guide. Unlike Vincent, Theo was calm, diplomatic, and seemed to possess an innate understanding of how to navigate the family's emotional minefield. Vincent would spend hours with Theo, taking him on long walks through the Dutch countryside, pointing out birds and flowers, inventing stories and games. With Theo, Vincent could be gentle, patient and loving in ways that seemed impossible for him in other relationships. Theo, in turn, looked up to his older brother with a devotion that would last their entire lives. The countryside around Groot-Zundert was Vincent's refuge. When the tensions at home became too much, he would disappear for hours, wandering the fields and forests that surrounded their village. He developed an almost mystical connection to nature, spending entire afternoons watching clouds move across the sky or studying the way light filtered through tree branches. Even as a child, Vincent saw the world differently than others. Where his siblings might see a simple tree, Vincent would notice how the bark changed colour in different lights, how the branches twisted in patterns that seemed to tell stories, how the leaves moved in ways that suggested hidden meanings. This intensity of observation, this hunger to really see the world around him, was both a gift and a burden that would define his entire life. School was a particular source of misery for Vincent. The local village school was a small single-room building where children of all ages learned together under the stern guidance of a single teacher. Vincent's emotional volatility and strange intensity made him a target for other children's cruelty. They sensed his difference and exploited it mercilessly. His academic performance was erratic. When a subject interested him, Vincent could demonstrate remarkable intelligence and insight. But when bored or frustrated, he would simply shut down, staring out the window or becoming disruptive. His teachers found him impossible to manage, alternately brilliant and impossible. By the time Vincent turned 11, his parents had decided that the village school was inadequate for their children's education. They made the difficult decision to send Vincent away to a boarding school in Zevenbergen, about 20 miles from home. For most children, this might have been an exciting adventure. For Vincent, it felt like abandonment. The boarding school was a harsh environment designed to break down individual will and rebuild students according to rigid academic and social standards. Vincent, already struggling with feelings of unworthiness and abandonment, found the experience traumatic. He was homesick constantly, wrote desperate letters home, begging to return, and began to withdraw further into himself. His academic work suffered terribly. The subjects that had once interested him became meaningless in the face of his emotional distress. Teachers complained that Vincent was sullen, uncooperative, and seemed to take no pride in his work. What they didn't understand was that the boy was in the midst of a profound depression that would shape the rest of his psychological development. The few friendships Vincent attempted at boarding school ended badly. His intensity frightened other boys, and his emotional needs were too great for children his own age to understand or meet. Vincent would throw himself into friendships with desperate devotion, overwhelming the other child until they pulled away. Each rejection deepened his sense that he was fundamentally unlovable. During school holidays, Vincent would return home, to find that family life had continued quite happily without him. His younger siblings had grown closer to each other and to their parents. Only Theo seemed genuinely happy to see him return, but even Theo had adapted to Vincent's absence and had formed new relationships within the family. These homecomings were bittersweet. Vincent felt like a visitor in his own home, watching the family he longed to be part of function perfectly well without him. The message seemed clear. His presence was not essential, his absence was not mourned, and his return was more of an obligation than a celebration. Pastor Van Gogh watched his eldest son's struggles with growing concern but little understanding. As a man of faith, he believed that life's difficulties were tests of character that could be overcome through prayer, discipline, and proper moral guidance. Vincent's emotional problem seemed to him like a failure of will rather than a genuine psychological condition, requiring compassion and support. Anna van Gogh found her son's intensity increasingly difficult to bear. Vincent's emotional needs seemed bottomless, and her attempts to provide comfort never seemed sufficient. She began to see his unhappiness as a character flaw, something that proper upbringing should have prevented. Her own unresolved grief over her first child made it impossible for her to recognize the depth of Vincent's pain. By the time Vincent reached his mid-teens, a pattern had been established that would repeat throughout his life. He would approach relationships and situations with tremendous hope and intensity, pouring his whole being into them. When they inevitably failed to meet his enormous emotional needs, he would become devastated, interpreting the failure as confirmation of his own unworthiness. This cycle of hope and disappointment, of desperate attachment followed by crushing rejection, was already well established by the time Vincent left childhood behind. The replacement child had grown into a young man who carried within him a profound sense of not belonging anywhere, of being too much for anyone to love, of being destined always to disappoint those he cared about most. The seeds of Vincent's future struggles with mental health, his tumultuous relationships, and his desperate search for meaning were all planted during these formative years in Groot Zundert. The boy who would grow up to create some of the world's most beloved art was learning day by day that he was unwanted, unlovable, and fundamentally flawed. Yet even in this darkness, there were hints of the extraordinary gift that lay dormant within him. His intense way of seeing the world, his emotional depth, his capacity for profound connection with nature and beauty. These were not just sources of pain, but also the raw materials from which genius would eventually emerge. The replacement child was already becoming the artist, though it would be many more years of struggle before Vincent would discover that his greatest weakness and his greatest strength were the very same thing. In January 1869, 16-year-old Vincent van Gogh stepped off a train in The Hague, carrying a single suitcase and a letter of introduction that would change his life. His uncle, also named Vincent van Gogh, had secured him a position at Goupil & Company, one of Europe's most prestigious art dealers. For a young man who had shown little promise in traditional academics, this seemed like salvation. The art world of the 1860s was a sophisticated machine of commerce and culture. Goupil & Company wasn't just selling paintings, they were shaping European taste, deciding which artists would become famous and which would remain unknown. They had galleries in Paris, London, Brussels, and The Hague, and their influence extended across continents. For Vincent to land a position there at 16 was extraordinary, a testament to his uncle's connections rather than his own qualifications. Vincent threw himself into this new world with characteristic intensity. He studied the inventory with obsessive dedication, memorizing not just the names of artists and titles of works, but prices, provenance, and the subtle gradations of quality that determine market value. His colleagues were impressed by his knowledge and his apparent passion for the work, but there was something troubling about Vincent's approach to the art business. While his co-workers saw beautiful objects to be sold to wealthy collectors, Vincent saw something deeper and more spiritual. He would stand for long minutes in front of certain paintings, completely absorbed, as if receiving some kind of religious revelation. This wasn't the detached professionalism that successful art dealing required. The paintings that moved Vincent most were not the fashionable works that brought Goupil the highest profits. Instead, he was drawn to scenes of peasant life, religious subjects, and landscapes that spoke to suffering and spiritual struggle. He particularly loved the work of Jean-François Millet, whose paintings of rural labourers seemed to Vincent to capture something sacred about human dignity in the face of hardship. For the first few years, Vincent's passionate knowledge served him well. Customers appreciated his genuine enthusiasm and deep familiarity with the works. His superiors noted his dedication and began giving him more responsibility. In 1873, they transferred him to their London branch, a promotion that should have marked the beginning of a successful career. London in the 1870s was the centre of the world's art market, and Goupil's gallery on Southampton Street was one of its most important venues. Vincent found lodgings with a widow named Ursula Lawyer and her daughter Eugenie in the suburb of Brixton. For a brief moment it seemed as though Vincent might finally find the happiness and stability that had eluded him throughout his childhood. Living with the Lawyer family gave Vincent his first taste of domestic warmth. Ursula Lawyer was kind and maternal in ways that his own mother had never been. She took an interest in his work, listened to his enthusiastic descriptions of paintings, and seemed genuinely fond of his company. For Vincent, who had spent years feeling like an unwelcome burden, this acceptance was intoxicating. But Vincent's capacity for misreading situations and investing them with more meaning than they could bear soon created problems. He convinced himself that Eugenie Lawyer was in love with him, interpreting her ordinary politeness as a romantic interest. In his mind, he constructed an entire future in which he would marry Eugenie. continue his successful career at Goupil, and finally find the love and acceptance he craved. The reality was quite different. Eugenie was already secretly engaged to another man, and Vincent's increasingly obvious infatuation made the entire household uncomfortable. When he finally worked up the courage to declare his love, Eugenie's horrified rejection was swift and absolute. She was kind but firm. She felt no romantic feelings for him whatsoever, and never had. The rejection devastated Vincent in ways that went far beyond normal romantic disappointment. It seemed to confirm every terrible thing he believed about himself, that he was unlovable, that he misunderstood everything, that his intense emotions were too much for anyone to bear. The safe haven he thought he had found with the lawyer family was suddenly a place of daily humiliation. Vincent's work at Goupil began to suffer immediately. The enthusiasm that had once charmed customers now seemed forced and desperate. He became argumentative with clients, especially wealthy collectors whom he began to see as shallow and materialistic. Instead of selling them the fashionable works they wanted, he would lecture them about the spiritual value of less commercial pieces. His behaviour became increasingly erratic. He would arrive late to work, spend long periods staring silently at certain paintings, and engage colleagues in intense theological discussions that made everyone uncomfortable. The young man who had once shown such promise was clearly falling apart, but no one knew how to help him. Vincent's letters home during this period reveal a mind in crisis. He wrote to Theo about feeling completely alone in the world, about questioning the value of everything he was doing, about searching desperately for some kind of meaning or purpose. The art dealing that had once excited him now seemed hollow and pointless. What was the value of selling beautiful objects to people who couldn't truly appreciate them? In 1875, Goupil transferred Vincent back to Paris, hoping that a change of scene might restore his effectiveness. But if anything, being in the centre of the European art world made Vincent's disillusionment worse. He saw more clearly than ever the commercial machinery that drove the art market, the way genuine artistic expression was packaged and sold to wealthy consumers who treated great paintings like fashionable accessories. Vincent began reading religious texts obsessively, particularly the Bible and Thomas à Kempis's The Imitation of Christ. He was searching for something that the art world couldn't provide, a sense of ultimate meaning, a way to connect with divine truth rather than earthly beauty. His colleagues watched with growing concern as their once promising associate transformed into a brooding, unpredictable figure. The final break came in 1876 when Vincent's behaviour became so disruptive that Goupil had no choice but to dismiss him. 7 years after beginning what should have been a brilliant career, Vincent found himself unemployed, spiritually adrift, and more convinced than ever that he was a failure at everything he attempted. But Vincent's religious awakening during his final months at Goupil had planted a seed. If he couldn't find meaning in selling art, perhaps he could find it in serving God. His father was a minister after all, and the Van Gogh family had a long tradition of religious service. Perhaps his true calling was not in the art galleries of Europe, but in the pulpits and mission fields where he could help suffering humanity. Vincent returned to England, this time as an unpaid assistant teacher at a small boarding school in Ramsgate. The headmaster, William Stokes, was looking for someone willing to work essentially for free in exchange for room and board. For Vincent, still reeling from his failure at Goupil, this seemed like an opportunity to start over and prove that he could be useful to the world. The conditions at the school were harsh. Vincent was responsible for teaching a variety of subjects to boys ranging in age from 10 to 14, despite having no formal teacher training. The pay was virtually non-existent, the food was poor, and the accommodations were Spartan. But Vincent threw himself into the work with characteristic intensity, seeing it as a form of religious service. His letters to Theo during this period show a man desperately trying to find meaning in difficult circumstances. He wrote about the satisfaction of helping young minds develop, about the spiritual value of patient teaching, about feeling closer to God through service to others. but underneath the forced optimism, there were hints of the same problems that had plagued him at Goupil. Vincent's teaching methods were as intense and unconventional as everything else about him. He would become completely absorbed in individual students who reminded him of himself, overwhelming them with attention and concern. His lessons often turned into passionate speeches about moral and spiritual issues that were far beyond his students' comprehension or interest. The headmaster began to receive complaints from parents about Vincent's strange behaviour and inappropriate intensity with their children. Some students found him frightening. Others simply couldn't understand what he was trying to teach them. It became clear that Vincent's emotional needs were interfering with his ability to do the job effectively. After a few months, the school released Vincent from his position. Once again, his intensity and inability to read social situations had led to failure. But Vincent interpreted this setback differently than his dismissal from Goupil. This time he saw it as evidence that God was calling him to something even more demanding, the ministry itself. Vincent's decision to become a preacher was driven by the same desperate search for meaning that had led him away from art dealing. He believed that if he could serve God directly, if he could bring comfort to the suffering and hope to the desperate, he would finally find the purpose that had eluded him throughout his young adult life. But becoming a minister required education and credentials that Vincent lacked. At 23, he was older than most seminary students and had no university degree. His academic record was spotty, his Latin was poor, and his social skills were questionable. Nevertheless, he was determined to try. Vincent enrolled in a preparatory program in Amsterdam, staying with his uncle Johannes, a respected naval admiral. The plan was for Vincent to improve his Latin and Greek, study theology, and eventually gain admission to the University of Amsterdam to complete his theological education. It should have been a straightforward path to the ministry he craved. But Vincent's approach to theological study was as problematic as his approach to everything else. He became obsessed with certain aspects of Christian doctrine while ignoring others. He would spend hours memorizing biblical passages that moved him emotionally, while struggling with the systematic theology and classical languages that form the foundation of ministerial education. His tutors found him impossible to teach. Vincent's learning style was intuitive and emotional, rather than analytical and systematic. He could deliver passionate speeches about Christian love and service, but he couldn't conjugate Latin verbs or parse Greek syntax with the precision that theological education required. After more than a year of struggle, it became clear that Vincent would never pass the examinations required for university admission. His family was disappointed, but not entirely surprised. Vincent's intensity and unconventional thinking had always made traditional academic success difficult for him. But Vincent refused to give up on his calling to the ministry. If he couldn't become an ordained minister through conventional channels, perhaps he could serve as an evangelist or missionary. The Belgian Evangelical Society offered a more practical path to religious service, focusing on spreading the gospel among the poor and working classes, rather than administering to established congregations. In 1878, Vincent enrolled in a 3-month evangelical training program in Brussels. This seemed perfect for his temperament and interests. Instead of studying ancient languages and abstract theology, he would learn practical skills for ministering to the poor, the sick, and the spiritually lost. Finally, Vincent thought, he had found work that matched his deepest convictions. The training program went well initially. Vincent's passion for serving others was obvious, and his instructors appreciated his dedication. But they also noticed troubling signs of the same intensity that had caused problems in his previous positions. Vincent's approach to evangelical work was extreme, even by the standards of zealous missionaries. After completing his training, Vincent was assigned to a temporary position in the Borinage, a coal mining region in Belgium, where living conditions were among the worst in Europe. The miners worked in dangerous back-breaking conditions for minimal pay. Their families crowded into company housing that was little better than slums. If Vincent wanted to minister to the suffering, he had certainly found the right place. Vincent arrived in the mining town of Wasmes in December 1878, determined to prove himself as an evangelist. He gave passionate sermons about Christian love and the promise of eternal salvation. He visited the sick and comforted the grieving. He seemed to be exactly what the Belgian Evangelical Society had hoped for in their missionary to the Borean age. But Vincent's understanding of Christian service was more extreme than anyone had anticipated. He believed that to truly serve the poor, he must become poor himself. He gave away his possessions to needy families, traded his decent clothing for rags, and moved from his relatively comfortable lodgings to a hovel that was barely fit for human habitation. Vincent's superiors were horrified. They had wanted him to minister to the poor, not become indistinguishable from them. His appearance became so shocking that it undermined his effectiveness as a preacher. How could he represent the dignity and hope of Christian faith while looking like the most desperate of beggars? The final straw came when Vincent began giving away not just his own possessions, but church property as well. He distributed communion wine to families who had no food, gave away hymn books to children who couldn't read, and used church funds to pay for medical care that the mining company should have provided. In July 1879, the Belgian Evangelical Society dismissed Vincent from his position. Their official reason was that his extreme behaviour was undermining the dignity of Christian ministry. But Vincent understood the real message, even in religious service, even when trying to help the most desperate people in society. His intensity was too much, his commitment too extreme, his way of being in the world too difficult for any institution to accept. The dismissal was crushing. Vincent had failed as an art dealer, failed as a teacher, and now failed as a preacher. At 26, he had tried 3 different careers and been rejected by all of them. Every path he had chosen had led to the same outcome. His employers and colleagues, initially impressed by his dedication, then increasingly disturbed by his intensity, and finally driven to reject him entirely. Vincent spent the following months wandering the mining region, supporting himself with odd jobs and continuing to preach informally to anyone who would listen. He was searching desperately for some explanation, some understanding of why he seemed destined to fail at everything he attempted. The answer, when it finally came to him, would redirect his life toward the work that would make him immortal. But for now, Vincent van Gogh was simply a failed preacher, alone in the world, convinced that he had nothing to offer anyone. In the summer of 1880, Vincent van Gogh sat in a squalid room in the Belgian mining town of Cuesmes, staring at a blank piece of paper. He was 27 years old, unemployed, and had just been rejected by every career path he had attempted. The art world had dismissed him, teaching had proven impossible, and even his calling to serve God had ended in humiliation. Most men in his position would have been contemplating their complete failure in life. Instead, Vincent picked up a pencil and began to draw. The decision wasn't sudden or dramatic. For months after his dismissal from the Evangelical Society, Vincent had been wandering the Borinage region, sleeping in miners' shacks, sharing their meagre meals, and trying to understand what his purpose in life might be. He had no money, no prospects, and no clear direction. But during those long, empty days, he found himself sketching the faces of the miners, the landscapes of the coalfields, the bent backs of workers emerging from the pits. These weren't artistic exercises. Vincent had always drawn casually, the way many people do when bored or distracted. But something had changed. The pencil marks he was making seemed to capture something essential about the suffering he saw around him, something that his sermons had never quite managed to express. Where words had failed him as a preacher, perhaps images might succeed. Vincent's first serious drawings were crude and awkward. His hand was untrained, his understanding of proportion and perspective elementary. But there was something in those early sketches that was unmistakably powerful, an intensity of observation, a desperate need to really see and record the world around him, the same quality that had made him impossible to manage in conventional careers might, he began to think, be exactly what art required. The transformation from failed preacher to aspiring artist didn't happen overnight. Vincent spent months teaching himself the basics of drawing, working with whatever materials he could afford or find. He copied illustrations from magazines, sketched peasants and labourers from life, and slowly began to develop the technical skills that his natural intensity had always lacked. His brother Theo had been watching Vincent's struggles with growing concern. 4 years younger than Vincent, Theo had succeeded where his older brother had failed. He had built a successful career as an art dealer in Paris, working for the same Goupil company that had once employed Vincent. Theo understood the art world in ways that Vincent never had, and he could see that his brother's passionate, obsessive nature might actually be suited to artistic creation. In August 1880, Theo wrote to Vincent with an offer that would change both their lives forever. He proposed to send Vincent a monthly allowance that would allow him to focus entirely on developing as an artist. It wasn't charity, Theo insisted. He genuinely believed that Vincent had the potential to create important work, and he was willing to invest in that possibility. The arrangement they established would continue for the rest of Vincent's life. Theo would send money, art supplies and emotional support, while Vincent would send paintings and letters describing his artistic development. It was more than a financial arrangement. It was a partnership between two very different men who shared an absolute belief in the value of art. Vincent's approach to learning art was characteristically intense and systematic. He knew he was starting late by conventional standards. Most serious artists began their training as teenagers, spending years in academies learning traditional techniques. At 27, Vincent had to compress that education into whatever time he could afford. He began with drawing, working primarily in pencil and charcoal. His subjects were the people and places he had come to know during his evangelical work: miners and their families, peasant workers, the harsh landscapes of industrial Belgium. These weren't fashionable subjects for art in 1880, but they were the subjects that Vincent understood most deeply. Vincent's early drawings show a man struggling to master basic technical skills, while being driven by an urgent need to express something profound about human suffering and dignity. His figures are often awkwardly proportioned, his perspective sometimes flawed, but there's an emotional honesty in the work that more technically proficient artists rarely achieved. As his confidence grew, Vincent began to think more seriously about formal artistic education. In October 1880, he moved to Brussels to study at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts. This was his attempt to gain the systematic training that might help him develop more quickly as an artist. But Vincent's experience at art school was predictably problematic. The academy taught drawing through copying plaster casts of ancient sculptures, a method designed to train students in ideal proportions and classical beauty. Vincent found this approach sterile and irrelevant to his interests. He wanted to draw real people living real lives, not idealized versions of ancient Greek gods. His instructors found Vincent as difficult as every other teacher had. He was older than most students, more serious about his work, and completely uninterested in the social aspects of student life. He would argue with professors about the value of different approaches to art, insist on drawing from life when they wanted him to copy casts, and generally disrupt the orderly progression of academic training. After a few months, Vincent left the academy. Formal education had failed him again, but this time he didn't see it as a personal failure. Instead, he recognized that his artistic development would have to happen on his own terms, through direct engagement with the subjects that moved him most deeply. Vincent returned to the countryside, this time settling in a small village called Eten, where his parents were now living. Pastor van Gogh had been transferred to this new parish, and the family hoped that Vincent might find stability by living at home while developing his artistic skills. For a brief period, it seemed as though this arrangement might work. Living with his family provided Vincent with a stable base and regular meals, luxuries he hadn't enjoyed for years. More importantly, it gave him access to a variety of subjects for his art: the local peasants, the surrounding landscape, and the changing seasons of rural Dutch life. He threw himself into drawing with renewed energy, working from dawn to dusk when the weather permitted. But the same patterns that had caused problems in Vincent's previous living situations soon emerged at home. His total absorption in his work made him difficult to live with. He would disappear for entire days, returning home covered in mud or charcoal, completely unaware of social obligations or family meals. His intensity about his art was as overwhelming as his religious fervour had been. The situation became more complicated when Vincent fell in love with his cousin, Kee Vos Stricker, a widow, who was visiting the family. Vincent's approach to romance was as obsessive and misguided as his approach to everything else. He convinced himself that Kee shared his feelings despite clear evidence to the contrary, and when she firmly rejected his advances, he refused to accept her answer. The incident that finally forced Vincent to leave home was both tragic and absurd. Desperate to speak with Kee after she had refused to see him, Vincent held his hand over a candle flame during a family dinner, declaring that he would keep it there until she agreed to talk with him. The family was horrified, and Kee left immediately. Vincent had once again managed to turn a difficult situation into a complete disaster through his inability to read social cues and control his emotional intensity. In December 1881, Vincent left his family home for good. At 28, he was once again homeless and dependent entirely on Theo's support, but this time he had a clearer sense of purpose. He was an artist now, whatever the costs or consequences. The work itself had become more important to him than social acceptance or conventional success. Vincent moved to The Hague, where he hoped to continue his artistic education by working with established artists. He became loosely associated with a group called The Hague School, painters who specialised in realistic depictions of Dutch landscapes and peasant life. Their work aligned closely with Vincent's interests, and he hoped to learn from their techniques. But Vincent's time in The Hague was marked by the same patterns of initial enthusiasm, followed by conflict and isolation. He rented a studio and began working with Anton Mauve, a respected painter who was married to one of Vincent's cousins. Mauve was initially impressed by Vincent's dedication and gave him lessons in oil painting and watercolour techniques. The relationship with Mauve might have provided Vincent with the artistic mentorship he desperately needed, but Vincent's personal life soon created complications that made professional collaboration impossible. He had begun living with a prostitute named Klasina Maria Hornig, known as CN, and her 2 children. Vincent saw this as an act of Christian charity, providing a home for a woman who had been abandoned by society. But to his family and artistic associates, Vincent's relationship with CN was scandalous and self-destructive. CN was pregnant with another man's child, struggled with alcoholism, and came from a background that middle-class Dutch society considered completely unacceptable. Vincent's insistence on treating her as a respectable partner made it impossible for him to maintain relationships within the conventional art world. Mauve and other members of the Hague School gradually distanced themselves from Vincent. They couldn't understand why a promising artist would deliberately sabotage his social position by living with a prostitute. Vincent, for his part, couldn't understand why people who claimed to care about art and truth would reject him based on his living arrangements. Despite the social isolation, Vincent's time in The Hague was crucial for his artistic development. Living with Cian and her children gave him access to subjects that few other artists were willing or able to depict: the daily struggles of the urban poor, the reality of women abandoned by respectable society, the dignity of people living on society's margins. His drawings and paintings from this period show a marked improvement in technical skill, combined with a deepening emotional complexity. Works like Sorrow, a drawing of Cian sitting naked and pregnant, demonstrate Vincent's ability to find beauty and meaning in subjects that conventional art ignored or romanticized. But the arrangement with Cian was ultimately unsustainable. Vincent's financial situation was precarious. dependent entirely on Theo's monthly allowance. Supporting a woman and 2 children stretched those resources beyond their limit. More troubling was Vincent's growing realization that his relationship with Cian was based more on his need to rescue someone than on genuine romantic love. Cian, for her part, had never asked to be rescued. She had survived on her own before meeting Vincent, and would continue to do so after he left. Vincent's attempts to reform her, to turn her into the respectable companion he thought he wanted, were as misguided as his attempts to hold his hand over a candle to win Key's love. In September 1883, Vincent made the painful decision to end his relationship with Cian. He could no longer afford to support her family, and he had come to understand that their relationship was preventing both of them from moving forward with their lives. It was one of the few times in Vincent's life that he chose to end a relationship before being rejected or dismissed. The breakup left Vincent feeling guilty and alone, but it also freed him to focus entirely on his artistic development. He had learned crucial technical skills during his time in The Hague, developed his own distinctive approach to depicting working-class subjects, and begun to understand that his intensity and unconventional perspective might actually be advantages in creating art. At 30, Vincent van Gogh was still struggling financially, still socially isolated, still unable to maintain stable relationships with family, friends or colleagues. But he had found his calling. The same passionate intensity that had made him impossible to manage as an art dealer, teacher or preacher was exactly what his art required. Vincent was beginning to understand that his failures in conventional careers hadn't been personal shortcomings but evidence that conventional careers were wrong for him. Art didn't require him to suppress his intensity or conform to social expectations. Instead, it demanded that he use every aspect of his difficult personality in service of creating something unprecedented. The failed preacher had become an artist. The transformation was far from complete, and the struggles were far from over. But for the first time in his adult life, Vincent van Gogh was doing work that matched his temperament, used his gifts, and offered the possibility that his suffering might serve a larger purpose. The pencil he had picked up in that mining town 3 years earlier had become the tool through which Vincent would eventually touch the hearts of millions of people he would never meet. But first, he would have to survive the decade of poverty, rejection and mental breakdown that lay ahead of him. In March 1886, Vincent van Gogh appeared unannounced at his brother Theo's apartment in Montmartre, carrying his few possessions and announcing that he had come to Paris to learn about modern art. Theo, who had been expecting only a letter, found himself face to face with a 33-year-old man whose appearance shocked him. Vincent looked older than his years, his face weathered by the harsh life he had been living, his clothes worn and unfashionable, but his eyes burned with the same intensity that had driven him through every failure and disappointment of the previous decade. Paris in the 1880s was the undisputed centre of the art world, a city where revolutionary ideas about painting were emerging from studios and cafes throughout Montmartre and the left bank. The impressionist movement had been challenging traditional academic art for more than a decade, and a new generation of artists was pushing those innovations even further. For Vincent, who had been working in isolation in the Dutch countryside, arriving in Paris was like stepping into the future. Theo had established himself as a successful art dealer with the Goupil Company, the same firm that had once employed Vincent. But unlike his brother, Theo had learned to navigate the art world's commercial and social demands, while maintaining genuine enthusiasm for innovative work. His apartment was filled with paintings by artists most people had never heard of: Claude Monet, Edgar Degas, Camille Pissarro, Paul Cézanne. These were the painters who were defining modern art, and Theo believed passionately in their importance. Vincent's arrival created immediate complications for his brother. Theo's apartment was small, designed for a bachelor's lifestyle, not for supporting an intense, unpredictable artist who worked constantly and had never learned conventional social skills. But Theo had been supporting Vincent financially for years, and he understood better than anyone else the depth of his brother's artistic commitment. If Vincent needed to be in Paris to develop as an artist, then Theo would make it work. The brothers established a routine that would continue for the next 2 years. Theo would leave each morning for his gallery, conducting the business of selling art to wealthy collectors and building relationships with established artists. Vincent would spend his days exploring the city, visiting museums and galleries, studying the work of painters he had only known through reproductions, and beginning to understand how far behind he was in his artistic education. The gap between Vincent's abilities and the work being produced by successful Parisian artists was enormous. His palette was still dominated by the dark browns and greys he had learned in Holland, while the Impressionists were exploring brilliant colours and innovative techniques that made traditional painting look old-fashioned. His subjects were still primarily peasants and workers, while fashionable artists were painting middle-class leisure activities and urban scenes. But Vincent approached this challenge with characteristic determination. Instead of being discouraged by how much he needed to learn, he threw himself into the task with desperate energy. He enrolled briefly at Fernand Cormon's studio, one of the most progressive teaching workshops in the city. Cormon's approach was more flexible than traditional academic training, allowing students to work from live models and experiment with different techniques. At Cormon's studio, Vincent encountered other aspiring artists who would become crucial figures in modern art. Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, Émile Bernard, and later Paul Gauguin. These men were young, ambitious, and excited by the possibilities that new artistic approaches were opening up. For the first time in his life, Vincent found himself in the company of people who shared his passionate commitment to art. But even in this more accepting environment, Vincent's intensity set him apart. While other students might spend a morning working on a single drawing, Vincent would complete multiple studies, approaching each pose from different angles, experimenting with various techniques, pushing himself to absorb as much as possible from every opportunity. His fellow students were impressed by his dedication, but often exhausted by his relentless energy. Toulouse-Lautrec, despite being almost a decade younger than Vincent, became something of a mentor and friend. Lautrec understood what it meant to be an outsider in conventional society, and he appreciated Vincent's complete dedication to his work. The two men would spend evenings in Montmartre cafes, discussing painting techniques and arguing about the direction that modern art should take. Through these relationships, Vincent began to understand the intellectual framework that underlay the new painting movements. The Impressionists weren't just using brighter colours because they looked pretty. They were trying to capture the actual experience of seeing light and colour in nature. The post-Impressionists who were emerging weren't just rebels against tradition. They were searching for the ways to express emotional and spiritual truths through visual means. Vincent's own work began to change dramatically during his first year in Paris. His palette lightened considerably as he experimented with the bright colours and broken brushstrokes he was learning from studying Impressionist paintings. He began painting urban subjects, views from Theo's apartment window, street scenes from Montmartre, portraits of working-class Parisians who reminded him of the subjects he had depicted in Holland. But Vincent's approach to modern techniques was distinctively his own. Where the Impressionists used broken colour to capture fleeting effects of light, Vincent used it to express emotional intensity. Where they painted pleasant leisure activities, he continued to focus on workers and people living on society's margins. He was learning the language of modern art, but speaking it with his own unmistakable accent. The transformation wasn't just technical, but personal. For the first time since his childhood, Vincent was living in close daily contact with someone who genuinely understood and supported his work. Theo didn't just provide financial support. He offered informed criticism, intellectual companionship, and emotional stability that Vincent had never experienced from anyone else. Their evening conversations became legendary among their friends. Vincent would return from a day of painting, filled with excitement about new discoveries and frustrated by technical problems he couldn't solve. Theo would listen patiently, offer suggestions based on his extensive knowledge of contemporary art, and help Vincent understand how his work related to broader developments in modern painting. But the intensity of living with Vincent was taking its toll on Theo. His brother's complete absorption in his work meant that he was oblivious to practical concerns like household management, social obligations, or even basic hygiene. Vincent would work until he was exhausted, eat irregularly, and fill the apartment with canvases, brushes, and the overwhelming smell of oil paint and turpentine. Vincent's social interactions with other artists were improving, but they remained unpredictable. He could be charming and insightful when discussing art, but he had no ability to engage in small talk or navigate the subtle social dynamics that governed artistic circles. He would interrupt conversations with passionate monologues about painting techniques, or fall into brooding silences that made everyone uncomfortable. The art dealers and collectors who visited Theo's gallery found Vincent fascinating, but impossible. His knowledge of art was impressive, and his commitment was obvious, but his intensity made people nervous. He couldn't simply show his work. He had to explain at length what he was trying to achieve, why traditional approaches were inadequate, and how his innovations would revolutionize painting. Most potential buyers found this overwhelming rather than persuasive. Vincent's lack of commercial success was becoming a source of increasing tension. Theo was supporting not just Vincent's basic needs but also the cost of his art supplies, which were considerable, given the rate at which he worked. The financial strain was significant, but more troubling was Vincent's growing sense that he was failing as an artist, despite all his efforts to learn and improve. As 1887 progressed, Vincent began to feel that Paris was becoming as much a trap as an opportunity. The city's artistic riches had educated him in ways that would have been impossible elsewhere, but the constant stimulation was also overwhelming his nervous system. He found himself unable to concentrate, jumping from one technique to another without fully mastering any of them. The urban environment that had initially excited him was beginning to feel oppressive. Vincent had always found his deepest inspiration in nature, and Paris offered little access to the landscapes and rural subjects that had sustained his work in Holland. He began to feel that he needed to leave the city in order to synthesize what he had learned into a mature artistic style. More troubling were the signs that his mental health was beginning to deteriorate under the constant pressure. Vincent had always been prone to mood swings and periods of intense anxiety, but living in Paris seemed to be amplifying these tendencies. He would work for days without adequate rest, survive on coffee and cigarettes, and push himself beyond reasonable physical limits in pursuit of artistic breakthroughs. His relationship with Theo, while still fundamentally strong, was showing strain. The brothers had never lived together as adults, and the adjustment was difficult for both of them. Vincent's needs were enormous and constant, while Theo was trying to maintain his own career and social life. Neither man was entirely comfortable with the arrangement, but both understood that it was necessary for Vincent's artistic development. By early 1888, Vincent had been in Paris for nearly 2 years. He had transformed himself from a provincial artist, working in an outdated style, to someone who understood and could employ the most advanced techniques of modern painting. His work from this period shows remarkable growth in technical sophistication and visual sophistication. But Vincent also recognized that he needed to find his own path forward. He had learned what he could from studying other artists' work and participating in Parisian artistic life. The next phase of his development would require him to move beyond imitation and influence toward the creation of a truly personal artistic vision. The decision to leave Paris wasn't sudden, but it was inevitable. Vincent needed space to work without the constant stimulation and social pressure of the art capital. He needed to return to the kind of natural subjects that had always inspired his best work, and he needed to test whether the technical skills he had acquired in Paris could be combined with his own emotional intensity to create something unprecedented in art. In February 1888, Vincent announced to Theo that he was leaving for the south of France. He had been reading about the bright light and vivid colours of Provence, and he believed that this environment might be exactly what he needed to synthesize everything he had learned into a mature artistic style. It was a decision that would lead to the most productive and celebrated period of his career, but also to the beginning of his final descent into madness. The failed preacher had become a modern artist. The provincial draftsman had mastered the techniques of impressionism and post-impressionism. But Vincent van Gogh still hadn't created the work that would make him immortal. That achievement lay ahead of him. In the blazing sun and lavender fields of southern France, where his intensity would finally find its perfect expression, in paintings that would astonish the world. On February 20th, 1888, Vincent van Gogh stepped off a train in Arles, a small city in the heart of Provence, and immediately felt that he had found paradise. After 2 exhausting years in the grey, crowded streets of Paris, the brilliant Mediterranean light hit him like a physical force. The sky was a blue more intense than any he had ever seen. The fields were carpeted with yellow flowers, and everywhere he looked colours seemed to vibrate with an energy that matched his own inner intensity. Vincent had come south with a specific plan. He believed that the strong light and vivid colours of Provence would allow him to create a new kind of painting, one that combined the technical innovations he had learned in Paris with an emotional directness that reflected his deepest convictions about art. He had been reading about Japanese woodblock prints with their bold colours and simplified forms, and he thought that the landscape of southern France might offer similar opportunities for artistic breakthrough. The timing of his arrival could not have been better. It was late winter, and the countryside was just beginning to bloom with the spectacular display that makes Provence famous throughout the world. Vincent threw himself into painting this landscape with characteristic obsession, working from sunrise to sunset, driven by an urgent need to capture everything he was seeing and feeling. His first paintings from Arles show an immediate transformation in his work. The sombre palette he had inherited from Dutch painting was completely abandoned in favour of brilliant yellows, intense blues and vibrant greens that seemed to glow with inner light. His brushstrokes became more confident and expressive, creating textures that were almost sculptural in their thickness and energy. But it wasn't just the landscape that excited Vincent. He believed that he had discovered the perfect environment for creating what he called the art of the future. The intense light of Provence revealed colours and relationships between colours that were invisible in northern climates. The simple rural life of the region seemed to offer direct access to fundamental human truths that urban civilization had obscured. Vincent rented a small yellow house on Place Lamartine, a modest building that would become legendary in art history. The house was barely adequate for living, with simple furniture and basic amenities, but Vincent saw it as the foundation for an ambitious dream. He would create an artist's colony in the south, bringing together the most innovative painters of his generation to work collaboratively in this ideal environment. The studio of the south, as Vincent called his dream, would be different from the competitive, commercial art world of Paris. Here, artists would support each other, share ideas freely, and focus entirely on pushing painting toward new possibilities. Vincent believed that the combination of Provence's extraordinary light, the region's affordable living costs, and the collaborative energy of like-minded artists would produce revolutionary advances in modern art. Vincent's first target for recruitment was Paul Gauguin, an artist he had met in Paris who had impressed him with his bold use of colour and his willingness to abandon traditional painting techniques. Gauguin was nearly 40 years old, had given up a successful career as a stockbroker to pursue art, and possessed the kind of artistic sophistication that Vincent admired but felt he lacked himself. The campaign to convince Gauguin to come to Arles became Vincent's obsession throughout the summer and fall of 1888. He wrote passionate letters describing the beauty of Provence, the possibilities for artistic collaboration, and his vision of a new kind of artistic community. He painted furiously, creating works that he hoped would demonstrate to Gauguin the unique opportunities that the South offered. Vincent's paintings during this period were unlike anything he had produced before. Works like The Bedroom, Sunflowers and The Starry Night over the Rhone combined technical mastery with emotional intensity in ways that seemed to transcend the limitations of traditional painting. His colours became almost supernatural in their brightness, his compositions more daring and original, his brushwork more expressive and personal. But the intensity of his work schedule was beginning to take a toll on Vincent's physical and mental health. He was painting at a pace that would have exhausted a much younger man, often completing a canvas every day or two. He survived on coffee, bread and tobacco, sleeping little and pushing his body beyond reasonable limits in pursuit of artistic breakthroughs. The isolation was also becoming problematic. Vincent had always struggled with loneliness, but in Arles he was cut off from the artistic community that had sustained him in Paris. The local population found him strange and somewhat frightening. His intense way of painting, standing for hours in the blazing sun with his easel, marked him as an eccentric foreigner whose behaviour was incomprehensible to practical-minded farmers and shopkeepers. Vincent's letters to Theo during this period reveal both extraordinary artistic confidence and growing psychological instability. He wrote about feeling that he was on the verge of discoveries that would revolutionise painting, but also about periods of dark depression when he questioned whether his work had any value at all. The mood swings were becoming more extreme and more frequent. In October 1888, Vincent's persistence had finally paid off. Gauguin agreed to come to Arles, partly out of genuine interest in Vincent's artistic vision, but primarily because Theo van Gogh had agreed to buy Gauguin's paintings in exchange for his collaboration with Vincent. It was a complex arrangement that mixed artistic idealism with commercial practicality. Vincent prepared for Gauguin's arrival with the excitement of a child anticipating Christmas. He decorated the yellow house with his most recent paintings, bought better furniture, and planned ambitious collaborative projects. He believed that Gauguin's arrival would mark the beginning of the artistic revolution he had been dreaming about since leaving Paris. When Gauguin finally arrived on October the 23rd, 1888, Vincent was almost delirious with joy. Here was a sophisticated artist who took his work seriously, someone who could provide both companionship and intellectual stimulation. Vincent threw himself into playing host, showing Gauguin around the countryside, introducing him to potential subjects for painting, and sharing his theories about the future of art. Initially, the collaboration seemed to be working exactly as Vincent had hoped. The two men painted together during the day, spent evenings discussing artistic theory, and seemed to be developing a productive creative partnership. Gauguin was impressed by Vincent's dedication and by some of the paintings he had produced during his months alone in Arles, but the fundamental differences in their personalities and artistic approaches soon created tensions. Vincent's working methods were spontaneous and emotionally driven. He painted directly from nature, responding immediately to what he saw and felt. Gauguin was more intellectual and calculated. He believed that art should be created from memory and imagination rather than direct observation. More problematic were their different social styles and daily routines. Vincent had adapted to the simple, solitary life of rural Provence. He ate basic food, wore working clothes, and focused entirely on painting. Gauguin, despite his bohemian reputation, had more sophisticated tastes and social needs. He found Arles provincial and boring, missed the stimulation of urban life, and grew increasingly restless as the weeks passed. Vincent sensed Gauguin's growing dissatisfaction and became desperate to please him. He modified his painting style to incorporate techniques that Gauguin advocated, agreed to work more from memory and imagination, and tried to suppress his own artistic instincts in order to maintain their collaboration. The results were disastrous. Vincent's paintings began to lose the spontaneous energy that made them powerful, and his psychological state became increasingly unstable. The breaking point came in late December 1888. Vincent had been drinking more heavily than usual, sleeping less and showing signs of severe psychological distress. His behaviour became erratic and sometimes threatening. He would make grandiose statements about their artistic mission one moment and fall into despairing self-criticism the next. On December 23rd, after a particularly heated argument about artistic theory, Vincent suffered what would now be recognised as a severe psychotic episode. The exact details of what happened that night remain unclear, but the outcome was horrifying. Vincent used a razor blade to cut off part of his left ear, wrapped it in paper and delivered it to a local brothel, apparently as a gift for one of the women who worked there. Gauguin found Vincent the next morning, lying in bed covered in blood. He immediately summoned a doctor and sent a telegram to Theo in Paris. Vincent was hospitalized, barely conscious, and for several days it was uncertain whether he would survive. The dream of the studio of the South had ended in the most dramatic and tragic way possible. Gauguin left Arles immediately, never to return. He was genuinely shocked by what had happened and felt some responsibility for Vincent's breakdown, but he also recognized that their collaboration was impossible. Vincent's intensity, which had initially impressed him, had revealed itself to be a form of mental illness that made normal social interaction impossible. When Vincent recovered sufficiently to leave the hospital, he found himself more isolated than ever. Word of his self-mutilation had spread throughout Arles, and the local population now viewed him with a mixture of fear and pity. Children would follow him in the streets, adults would cross to the other side when they saw him coming, and shopkeepers would serve him reluctantly, if at all. Vincent attempted to resume painting, creating some remarkable self-portraits that showed him with his bandaged ear. These works are among the most psychologically penetrating images ever created, revealing a man who had looked directly into his own madness and somehow found the strength to document what he had seen there. But the productive period in Arles was essentially over. Vincent's mental health continued to deteriorate, marked by periodic episodes of psychosis, depression, and paranoid thinking. The townspeople petitioned to have him removed from the community, and even Vincent began to recognise that he needed more structured care than he could provide for himself. In May 1889, exactly 15 months after arriving in Arles with such hope and excitement, Vincent voluntarily admitted himself to the Saint-Paul de Moselle asylum in nearby Saint-Remy. The Yellow House dream had ended in complete failure, but it had also produced some of the most extraordinary paintings in the history of art. Vincent's time in Arles had proven both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. His ability to see and feel more intensely than other people had enabled him to create art of unprecedented emotional power. But that same intensity had also made it impossible for him to maintain the human relationships that might have sustained him through his struggles. The dream of the Studio of the South revealed the tragic contradiction at the heart of Vincent's life. He desperately needed human connection and collaborative relationships, but his psychological makeup made such connections impossible to maintain. He had created his greatest work while completely alone, painting in the blazing sun of Provence, transforming his isolation and madness into images that would eventually touch millions of people he would never meet. On May 8th, 1889, Vincent van Gogh walked through the gates of the Saint-Paul de Moselle asylum in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, carrying a small bag of personal belongings and an uncertain future. The ancient monastery-turned-mental hospital sat among olive groves and cypress trees, its stone walls weathered by centuries of Mediterranean sun. For Vincent, who had spent the previous months battling increasingly severe episodes of mental illness, the asylum represented both refuge and prison. The decision to commit himself had not been easy. After his breakdown in Arles and the severing of his ear, Vincent had experienced several more psychotic episodes that left him unable to care for himself. The townspeople of Arles had grown increasingly hostile, petitioning local authorities to remove him from their community. Even Vincent recognised that he needed more structured care than he could provide for himself in the Yellow House. Dr. Théophile Perron, the asylum's chief physician, diagnosed Vincent with acute mania with hallucinations of sight and hearing. In 1889, psychiatric treatment was primitive by modern standards. the asylum offered little more than basic shelter, regular meals and supervision to prevent patients from harming themselves or others. There were no effective medications for mental illness, no therapeutic programs, and little understanding of the biological basis of psychiatric conditions. Vincent's accommodation was Spartan, a small room with barred windows, a simple bed, a wooden table and a single chair. The walls were thick stone, designed more for containment than comfort. Yet after months of chaos and uncertainty, Vincent found the routine of institutional life oddly comforting. He would wake at sunrise, eat simple meals at regular intervals, and spend his days in the company of other patients whose grip on reality was as tenuous as his own. The asylum population was a cross-section of 19th century mental illness. Patients suffering from what would now be diagnosed as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe depression, and various forms of dementia. Many had been abandoned by their families, left to spend their remaining years in institutional care. Vincent was unusual among the inmates, because he continued to receive regular financial support from Theo, and because he maintained the ability to work during his lucid periods. Dr. Pyron was skeptical about allowing Vincent to continue painting. Many physicians of the era believed that artistic activity was unhealthy for mental patients, potentially overstimulating their already disturbed minds. But Vincent argued passionately that painting was not the source of his illness, but rather his primary means of maintaining psychological stability. Work, he insisted, was the only thing that kept him connected to reality during his darkest periods. Eventually, Pyron agreed to let Vincent paint, but with strict limitations. He could work only during supervised periods, only in designated areas of the asylum grounds, and only when his behaviour indicated that he was mentally stable. Vincent accepted these conditions gratefully, understanding that any opportunity to continue his art was better than being forced to abandon it entirely. Vincent's first paintings from the asylum show a marked change in his artistic vision. The brilliant colours and optimistic energy of his Arles period were replaced by more subdued tones and turbulent swirling compositions that seemed to reflect his inner psychological state. The famous The Starry Night was painted during this period, its swirling sky and distorted landscape representing not just Vincent's observation of nature, but his experience of mental illness itself. The painting process became Vincent's lifeline to sanity. During his lucid periods, he would work with desperate intensity, as if trying to capture as much as possible. Before the next episode of illness struck, he painted the view from his asylum window repeatedly, documenting the changing seasons and times of day. He painted the asylum garden, fellow patients, and the surrounding countryside, always searching for beauty and meaning in circumstances that seemed designed to crush hope. Vincent's letters to Theo during this period provide a heartbreaking window into his psychological struggle. He wrote about the terror of losing control of his mind, about the shame of being confined to a mental institution, and about his desperate fear that his illness would prevent him from ever completing his artistic mission. Yet even in his darkest moments, Vincent maintained his commitment to painting, and his belief that art could serve some larger purpose. The episodes of mental illness followed no predictable pattern. Vincent might work steadily for weeks or months, producing paintings of extraordinary quality, only to be suddenly overwhelmed by hallucinations, paranoid delusions, or crippling depression that left him unable to function. During these periods he would be confined to his room, sometimes for days at a time, while Dr. Pyron and the asylum staff waited for the crisis to pass. What made Vincent's situation particularly tragic was his awareness of his own condition. Unlike many mental patients, he retained enough insight to understand what was happening to him. He could recognize the onset of psychotic episodes, understand the irrational nature of his delusions, and feel profound shame about his inability to control his own mind. This self-awareness made his suffering more acute, but also enabled him to fight against his illness in ways that less aware patients could not. Vincent's artistic output during his year at Saint-Paul de Mausolée was remarkable both in quantity and quality. Despite the limitations imposed by his confinement and his periodic episodes of illness, he completed nearly 150 paintings and drawings. Many of these works are now considered masterpieces, including irises, the mulberry tree, and several self-portraits that rank among the most psychologically penetrating images ever created. The self-portraits from this period are particularly revealing. Vincent painted himself with brutal honesty, showing the toll that mental illness was taking on his appearance and spirit. His face appears gaunt in age beyond his years, his eyes haunted by experiences that defied ordinary description. Yet these paintings also reveal tremendous courage. The act of looking directly at his own suffering and transforming it into art required a kind of bravery that few people possess. Vincent's relationship with his fellow patients was complex. Most were too ill to engage in meaningful conversation, but Vincent felt a deep sympathy for their suffering. He saw in their faces the same anguish that he experienced during his own episodes of illness, and he began to understand that his condition placed him in the company of humanity's most vulnerable members. This realization was both humbling and oddly comforting. The asylum's location in the heart of Provence continued to inspire Vincent's work. The landscape outside his barred windows provided subjects that connected him to the natural world he had always loved. He painted olive trees with twisted, tortured branches that seemed to mirror his own psychological state. He painted cypress trees reaching toward the sky like dark flames, and fields of wheat that rippled in patterns that suggested both beauty and chaos. But Vincent also struggled with the fundamental loneliness of his situation. Theo continued to provide financial and emotional support through letters, but Vincent was cut off from the artistic community that had sustained him in Paris and the dream of collaboration that had motivated him in Arles. He was creating some of his greatest work in complete isolation, with no audience other than the asylum staff and his fellow patients. As 1889 turned to 1890, Vincent began to feel that his time at the asylum had served its purpose. The structured environment had provided him with stability during a crucial period, but he also recognized that institutional life was limiting his artistic development. He longed to return to normal society, to test whether he could manage his illness while living independently and continuing his work as an artist. Dr. Pyron was reluctant to discharge Vincent, fearing that the stresses of independent life might trigger another severe episode. But Vincent argued persuasively that he had learned to recognize the warning signs of his illness and could take steps to protect himself during vulnerable periods. He had also developed painting techniques that seemed to help him maintain psychological stability even during difficult times. The decision to leave Saint-Paul-de-Mosol was not made lightly. Vincent understood that he was taking a considerable risk, that leaving the safety of institutional care might lead to another breakdown that could be even more severe than previous episodes. But he also knew that his artistic mission was not yet complete, and that he needed freedom to pursue the work that gave his life meaning. In May 1890, exactly 1 year after entering the asylum, Vincent van Gogh walked back through the gates of Saint-Paul-de-Mosol as a discharged patient. He carried with him a portfolio of paintings that documented his year of confinement, works that transformed personal suffering into universal statements about the human condition. The asylum years had tested Vincent's sanity, his courage and his commitment to art. He had survived, but the experience had changed him in ways that would become apparent in the final desperate months of his life. Vincent's year in the asylum had proven something important about the relationship between mental illness and artistic creativity. His psychological condition had not prevented him from creating great art. Instead, it had provided him with insights into human suffering that deepened and intensified his artistic vision. The man who left Saint-Paul-de-Mosol was damaged but not defeated, carrying within him both the seeds of his final artistic triumphs and the forces that would soon destroy him entirely. On May 8, 1889, Vincent van Gogh walked through the gates of the Saint-Paul-de-Mosol asylum in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, carrying a small bag of personal belongings in an uncertain future. The ancient monastery-turned-mental hospital sat among olive groves and cypress trees, its stone walls weathered by centuries of Mediterranean sun. For Vincent, who had spent the previous months battling increasingly severe episodes of mental illness, the asylum represented both refugee and prison. The decision to commit himself had not been easy. After his breakdown in Arles and the severing of his ear, Vincent had experienced several more psychotic episodes that left him unable to care for himself. The townspeople of Arles had grown increasingly hostile, petitioning local authorities to remove him from their community. Even Vincent recognized that he needed more structured care than he could provide for himself in the Yellow House. Dr. Théophile Péron, the asylum's chief physician, diagnosed Vincent with acute mania with hallucinations of sight and hearing. In 1889, psychiatric treatment was primitive by modern standards. The asylum offered little more than basic shelter, regular meals and supervision to prevent patients from harming themselves or others. There were no effective medications for mental illness, no therapeutic programs, and little understanding of the biological basis of psychiatric conditions. Vincent's accommodation was Spartan, a small room with barred windows, a simple bed, a wooden table and a single chair. The walls were thick stone, designed more for containment than comfort. Yet after months of chaos and uncertainty, Vincent found the routine of institutional life oddly comforting. He would wake at sunrise, eat simple meals at regular intervals, and spend his days in the company of other patients whose grip on reality was as tenuous as his own. The asylum population was a cross-section of 19th century mental illness, patients suffering from what would now be diagnosed as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe depression, and various forms of dementia. Many had been abandoned by their families, left to spend their remaining years in institutional care. Vincent was unusual among the inmates because he continued to receive regular financial support from Theo, and because he maintained the ability to work during his lucid periods. Dr. Péron was skeptical about allowing Vincent to continue painting. Many physicians of the era believed that artistic activity was unhealthy for mental patients, potentially overstimulating their already disturbed minds. But Vincent argued passionately that painting was not the source of his illness, but rather his primary means of maintaining psychological stability. Work, he insisted, was the only thing that kept him connected to reality during his darkest periods. Eventually, Péron agreed to let Vincent paint, but with strict limitations. He could work only during supervised periods, only in designated areas of the asylum grounds, and only when his behaviour indicated that he was mentally stable. Vincent accepted these conditions gratefully, understanding that any opportunity to continue his art was better than being forced to abandon it entirely. Vincent's first paintings from the asylum show a marked change in his artistic vision. The brilliant colours and optimistic energy of his Arles period were replaced by more subdued tones and turbulent swirling compositions that seemed to reflect his inner psychological state. The famous The Starry Night was painted during this period, its swirling sky and distorted landscape representing not just Vincent's observation of nature but his experience of mental illness itself. The painting process became Vincent's lifeline to sanity. During his lucid periods, he would work with desperate intensity, as if trying to capture as much as possible. Before the next episode of illness struck, he painted the view from his asylum window repeatedly, documenting the changing seasons and times of day. He painted the asylum garden, fellow patients, and the surrounding countryside, always searching for beauty and meaning in circumstances that seemed designed to crush hope. Vincent's letters to Theo during this period provide a heartbreaking window into his psychological struggle. He wrote about the terror of losing control of his mind, about the shame of being confined to a mental institution, and about his desperate fear that his illness would prevent him from ever completing his artistic mission. Yet even in his darkest moments, Vincent maintained his commitment to painting and his belief that art could serve some larger purpose. The episodes of mental illness followed no predictable pattern. Vincent might work steadily for weeks or months, producing paintings of extraordinary quality, only to be suddenly overwhelmed by hallucinations, paranoid delusions, or crippling depression that left him unable to function. During these periods he would be confined to his room, sometimes for days at a time, while Dr. Pyron and the asylum staff waited for the crisis to pass. What made Vincent's situation particularly tragic was his awareness of his own condition. Unlike many mental patients, he retained enough insight to understand what was happening to him. He could recognize the onset of psychotic episodes, understand the irrational nature of his delusions, and feel profound shame about his inability to control his own mind. This self-awareness made his suffering more acute, but also enabled him to fight against his illness in ways that less aware patients could not. Vincent's artistic output during his year at Saint Paul de Moselle was remarkable, both in quantity and quality. Despite the limitations imposed by his confinement and his periodic episodes of illness, he completed nearly 150 paintings and drawings. Many of these works are now considered masterpieces, including irises, the mulberry tree, and several self-portraits that rank among the most psychologically penetrating images ever created. The self-portraits from this period are particularly revealing. Vincent painted himself with brutal honesty, showing the toll that mental illness was taking on his appearance and spirit. His face appears gaunt and aged beyond his years, his eyes haunted by experiences that defied ordinary description. Yet these paintings also reveal tremendous courage. The act of looking directly at his own suffering and transforming it into art required a kind of bravery that few people possess. Vincent's relationship with his fellow patients was complex. Most were too ill to engage in meaningful conversation, but Vincent felt a deep sympathy for their suffering. He saw in their faces the same anguish that he experienced during his own episodes of illness, and he began to understand that his condition placed him in the company of humanity's most vulnerable members. This realization was both humbling and oddly comforting. The asylum's location in the heart of Provence continued to inspire Vincent's work. The landscape outside his barred windows provided subjects that connected him to the natural world he had always loved. He painted olive trees with twisted, tortured branches that seemed to mirror his own psychological state. He painted cypress trees reaching toward the sky like dark flames, and fields of wheat that rippled in patterns that suggested both beauty and chaos. But Vincent also struggled with the fundamental loneliness of his situation. Theo continued to provide financial and emotional support through letters, but Vincent was cut off from the artistic community that had sustained him in Paris, and the dream of collaboration that had motivated him in Arles. He was creating some of his greatest work in complete isolation, with no audience other than the asylum staff and his fellow patients. As 1889 turned to 1890, Vincent began to feel that his time at the asylum had served its purpose. The structured environment had provided him with stability during a crucial period, but he also recognized that institutional life was limiting his artistic development. He longed to return to normal society, to test whether he could manage his illness while living independently and continuing his work as an artist. Dr. Pyron was reluctant to discharge Vincent, fearing that the stresses of independent life might trigger another severe episode. But Vincent argued persuasively that he had learned to recognize the warning signs of his illness and could take steps to protect himself during vulnerable periods. He had also developed painting techniques that seemed to help him maintain psychological stability even during difficult times. The decision to leave Saint Paul de Moselle was not made lightly. Vincent understood that he was taking a considerable risk, that leaving the safety of institutional care might lead to another breakdown that could be even more severe than previous episodes. But he also knew that his artistic mission was not yet complete, and that he needed freedom to pursue the work that gave his life meaning. In May 1890, exactly 1 year after entering the asylum, Vincent van Gogh walked back through the gates of Saint Paul de Moselle as a discharged patient. he carried with him a portfolio of paintings that documented his year of confinement, works that transformed personal suffering into universal statements about the human condition. The asylum years had tested Vincent's sanity, his courage and his commitment to art. He had survived, but the experience had changed him in ways that would become apparent in the final desperate months of his life. Vincent's year in the asylum had proven something important about the relationship between mental illness and artistic creativity. His psychological condition had not prevented him from creating great art. Instead, it had provided him with insights into human suffering that deepened and intensified his artistic vision. The man who left Saint Paul de Moselle was damaged but not defeated, carrying within him both the seeds of his final artistic triumphs and the forces that would soon destroy him entirely. Vincent van Gogh was buried on July 30th, 1890, in the small cemetery of Auvers-sur-Oise, mourned by fewer than a dozen people. His grave was marked with a simple stone that gave no hint of the extraordinary artistic legacy he had left behind. The man who would eventually be recognized as one of history's greatest painters died believing himself to be a complete failure, having sold only one painting during his entire career and lived his final years as a financial burden on his devoted brother. Theo van Gogh was devastated by Vincent's death. The two brothers had shared a bond that went far beyond normal family relationships. They had been partners in an artistic mission that neither fully understood, but both believed was somehow essential. Theo had invested not just money, but his entire emotional life in supporting Vincent's career, and his brother's suicide felt like the failure of everything he had worked toward for more than a decade. 6 months after Vincent's death, Theo suffered a complete mental and physical breakdown. The stress of losing his brother, combined with his own deteriorating health and mounting financial pressures, proved too much to bear. On January 25th, 1891, Theo died in a Dutch asylum, leaving behind his wife Jo and their infant son Vincent Willem. The brothers who had lived such intertwined lives died within months of each other, both believing that their shared dream of artistic recognition had been nothing more than a costly delusion. Jo van Gogh Bonge, Theo's widow, found herself in possession of hundreds of Vincent's paintings and thousands of letters documenting help in his artistic development. Most art dealers of the era would have seen this collection as worthless clutter, the residue of two men's expensive obsession with uncommercial art. But Jo recognised something in Vincent's work that the art world of 1890 had failed to see. A visual language that spoke directly to human emotions in ways that traditional painting had never achieved. Jo made a decision that would change art history. Instead of selling Vincent's paintings for whatever small amounts they might bring, she dedicated her life to preserving and promoting his work. She carefully catalogued every piece, organised the letters that documented his artistic thinking, and began the slow process of introducing Vincent's art to a world that was gradually becoming ready to understand its revolutionary significance. The transformation of Vincent van Gogh from unknown failure to international icon didn't happen overnight. In the 1890s, his work was still considered crude and amateurish by most critics. The bright colours and expressive brushstrokes that had marked him as an outsider during his lifetime continued to puzzle audiences accustomed to more traditional artistic approaches. But gradually, a small group of artists and collectors began to recognise that Vincent had discovered something unprecedented in the history of painting. The first breakthrough came in 1901, when a major exhibition of Vincent's work was held in Paris. The paintings that had been rejected by galleries during his lifetime suddenly seemed prophetic of directions that younger artists were beginning to explore. The Fauve movement, led by artists like Henri Matisse, embraced the kind of bold colour relationships that Vincent had pioneered. The German expressionists found in his emotional directness a model for their own rejection of academic restraint. By 1910, 20 years after Vincent's death, his reputation was beginning to grow beyond the small circle of avant-garde artists and collectors who had first appreciated his work. Major museums began acquiring his paintings, and art critics started to recognise that his apparent technical limitations were actually innovative approaches to visual expression. The man who had died believing he was a failure was posthumously being hailed as a revolutionary who had opened new possibilities for modern art. The irony of Vincent's growing fame was profound and heartbreaking. During his lifetime, he had desperately craved the recognition that would have validated his sacrifices and justified the faith that Theo had shown in him. He had written passionate letters about wanting to contribute something meaningful to the world, to create art that would speak to ordinary people about beauty and suffering and hope. That recognition was coming exactly as he had imagined it, but decades too late to provide him with any comfort or satisfaction. The financial transformation was equally dramatic. Paintings that Vincent had been unable to sell for modest sums during his lifetime began commanding increasingly impressive prices. By the 1920s, his works were selling for thousands of dollars. By the 1950s, major museums were paying hundreds of thousands for individual pieces. Today, Vincent's paintings regularly sell for tens of millions of dollars, making him one of the most commercially successful artists in history. The ultimate irony came in 1987 when Vincent's painting Irises, created during his time at the St. Paul Asylum, sold for $53.9 million, setting a new record for the highest price ever paid for a painting at auction. The work that had been completed by a man living in a mental institution, supported entirely by his brother's modest salary, had become one of the most valuable objects ever created by human hands. But the transformation of Vincent van Gogh into a global icon extended far beyond the art world. His story resonated with people who had never set foot in an art museum, who knew nothing about painting techniques or art history, but who recognized something essential in his struggle against mental illness, poverty, and social rejection. Vincent became a symbol of the misunderstood artist, the genius whose vision was too advanced for his own time. This popular mythology, while inspiring to many people, also distorted the reality of Vincent's life and work. He was transformed into a romantic figure, whose madness was seen as the source of his creativity, whose suffering was romanticized as necessary for his artistic achievement. This interpretation missed the more complex truth, that Vincent had created great art not because of his mental illness but in spite of it, that his work represented a triumph of human will over circumstances that might have destroyed a less determined person. The letters between Vincent and Theo, carefully preserved by Joe and eventually published, provided unprecedented insight into the mind of a great artist. These documents revealed not the mad genius of popular imagination, but a thoughtful, articulate man struggling to understand his place in the world and to create art that would serve some larger purpose. The letters showed Vincent's deep reading in literature and philosophy, his careful analysis of other artists' techniques, and his systematic approach to developing his own artistic vision. Modern psychiatric analysis of Vincent's symptoms has suggested that he may have suffered from temporal lobe, epilepsy, bipolar disorder, or acute intermittent porphyria, rather than the simple madness that earlier generations had assumed. These diagnoses don't diminish the tragedy of his suffering, but they do suggest that his condition was a medical illness, rather than an inevitable consequence of artistic temperament. Vincent's influence on subsequent generations of artists has been immeasurable. Nearly every major artistic movement of the 20th century can trace some connection to innovations that he pioneered. The Expressionists found in his emotional directness a model for their own rejection of academic restraint. The Fauvists adopted his bold use of colour. Abstract artists saw in his increasingly non-representational brushwork a pathway toward pure visual expression. But perhaps more importantly, Vincent van Gogh changed how ordinary people think about art itself. His paintings speak to viewers who have no training in the artistic appreciation, who respond instinctively to the emotional honesty and visual power of his work. Museums that display his paintings are consistently crowded with people from all backgrounds, drawn by something in his vision that transcends cultural and educational boundaries. The Vincent van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, built to house the largest collection of his work, receives more than 2 million visitors each year. People travel from around the world to see paintings created by a man who died believing that his art was worthless. The museum's guest books are filled with comments from visitors who describe feeling personally moved by Vincent's story, who see in his struggle a reflection of their own battles against depression, isolation, and the feeling of being misunderstood. The tragedy of Vincent van Gogh's life lies not just in his early death, but in the timing of that death. He died just as he was reaching artistic maturity, just as he was creating the work that would eventually establish his reputation. Had he lived even a few more years, he might have witnessed the beginning of the recognition that would have validated everything he had sacrificed for his art. The correspondence between Vincent and Theo reveals that both brothers sensed they were involved in something historically important, even if they couldn't predict exactly what that importance would be. They understood that Vincent was creating a new kind of painting, one that prioritized emotional truth over technical perfection, that found beauty in subjects previous generations had ignored, that spoke directly to viewers' hearts rather than their intellects. Today, Vincent van Gogh's story serves as both inspiration and warning. His ultimate triumph proves that artistic vision can eventually overcome social rejection and critical misunderstanding. But his personal tragedy demonstrates the human cost of genius that arrives before the world is ready to accept it. He created some of humanity's most beloved art, while living in almost complete isolation from the society that would eventually celebrate him. Vincent van Gogh died believing he was a failure, but he became one of history's most successful artists. He lived in poverty, but created works worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He was rejected by his contemporaries, but beloved by subsequent generations. He suffered from mental illness, but produced art that has brought joy and meaning to millions of people. The man who once wrote, "I want to touch people with my art," achieved exactly what he hoped for, touching more people than he could ever have imagined. But the cruel irony remains that he never knew it, never experienced the recognition that might have eased his suffering, never understood that his apparent failures were actually the foundation for one of the greatest artistic legacies in human history. Vincent van Gogh's life ended in tragedy, but his story ultimately transcends that tragedy. He proved that art can outlive the artist, that vision can eventually overcome rejection, and that even the most troubled life can leave behind something of permanent beauty and value. The replacement child who had grown up feeling unwanted became one of the most loved figures in cultural history, though he never lived to know it.